Welcome to the fourth series of Understanding Islam. We've called this series Bearers of the Final Message. And we're going to begin by exploring the expansion of Muslim rule in the first 120 years after the death of the Prophet. You can imagine that Prophet Muhammad was a charismatic leader. He attracted people to follow him so that they just wanted to be in his company. He succeeded in doing something that wasn't done before, that is to unite the Bedouin clans, to unite the Arabs of the peninsula, and to bring them under one banner and under one leader. Now, by the time that he died, he had most of the lower part of the Arabian Peninsula either under his direct control, or he'd made treaties with the various different clans of the interior. It's clear, though, that he didn't think of himself as just being someone who was sent to the people of the Arabian Peninsula, to the people of Mecca and Medina. He saw himself as being part of the Hebrew line of prophets. He knew that his community were in an intimate relationship with the Christians. We know, for example, that when they were being persecuted in Mecca, he sent quite a significant proportion of his community to take refuge with the Christian leader of Abyssinia. We know also that he orientated his community toward Jerusalem for prayer during the time in Mecca and for the first 16 months in Medina. We know also that toward the end of his life, the Prophet was dictating letters that should be sent to the people of the various groups who were in power around the world at that time. So he wrote to the Byzantines, to the Persians, and he said to them, "I am the Prophet of God, I am the bearer of the final message, embrace Islam." And so there is this character then to the life and teaching of the Prophet, which sees itself as being involved much more widely than just the Arabian Peninsula. We know that just before his death, he'd actually dispatched an army to go and work toward Syria. So that was clearly part of his own goal. This is part of God's blessing. As the bearer of the final message, Muslims will see that God blesses them with military victory, with economic power, both in this world and in the next. And therefore expansion was part of the religious political system. Now, not surprisingly, after the Prophet died, there were some of the Bedouin clans who said, the treaties are now cancelled, the deal is off, and they rebelled against the leadership of the Muslim community of Medina. Now, that is an act of treason, but in order to do it, they said, we're no longer Muslims. That is a religious act, that is apostasy. And so we can see the linking together of treason, politics, and apostasy, a religious act. And the first Caliph, Abu Bakr, put them under threat from the army to reverse that decision and to come back on board. Now, how do you reverse it? Well, you make a religious act, you reconvert to the ways of Islam, and this then is your political act undoing your treason. Now, not surprisingly then, treason, apostasy, these two things get linked in Islamic law and in Islamic history. And the Qur'an actually speaks about two forms of apostasy. There is what we can call simple apostasy. Somebody decides that they're no longer going to walk in the way of Islam. And then there's another form of apostasy, this we can call compounded apostasy. When you compound your apostasy by treason, by open attack upon the Muslim community, by vilification of the Qur'an and of the Prophet, and by encouraging other people to do the same thing. Now, this compounded apostasy then can carry the death penalty. When Islamic law was codified and written down, Islam was a political entity. Therefore, apostasy meant going over to the enemy. So we can see that in the written code of the Sharia, then apostasy becomes punished by the death penalty. It's only really in the last few decades, where so many Muslims are living as minorities in non-Muslim lands, that some Muslim scholars have reconsidered this question, and they can see that actually we need to think also about simple apostasy also. I decide I'm no longer going to follow the way of Islam. That's not accountable to the human court, but it is of course accountable to God on the Day of Judgment. We see then this religious political expansion of Muslim rule. Now, at the first major battle in 624 between the Meccans and the Muslims of Medina, we're told in the Qur'an that angels came to fight on the side of the Muslims so that they would secure victory. Therefore, this was seen to be the work of God, and so securing victory in battle was through the blessing of God. The Muslims were the tools, the handwork of God, actually establishing Muslim rule on earth. And we see the Prophet dies in 632, and then the Muslim armies expand up through the Arabian Peninsula so that Damascus, Syria, comes under Muslim rule from 637. Jerusalem comes under Muslim rule in 637. Now, Jerusalem, you remember, is very important in Muslim understanding. It is the third of the two most holy cities of Islam. It is called the Holy City in the Qur'an, and therefore Caliph Umar himself came forward to take the surrender of Jerusalem. Caliph Umar declined to pray in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Instead, he went out to offer his prayers in a piece of waste ground that was nearby. That waste ground turned out to be the Temple Mount, the place where the old Jewish temple had stood before it was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70. And it was there that he prayed. Now, under the time of the Christians in Jerusalem, that piece of ground had become a rubbish dump. So what the Caliph was doing in going to pray there was showing respect for the Christian holy places of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, for example. Unfortunately, as we know with the eyes of history, he was also praying on the Temple Mount, and therefore the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is built traditionally in the place at which he prayed, is built on the Temple Mount, as is the Dome of the Rock. Once they had reached the Mediterranean coast, then the Muslim armies started to expand, first of all to the west. So the great Egyptian seaport of Alexandria comes under Muslim rule by 642, and then to the east, also down into Iraq, so that Iraq comes under Muslim rule from 641. And then we get a further expansion to the east. Persia, the first non-Arab country to come under Islamic rule, comes under the rule of the Islamic Empire in 650, and that is the end of the Seleucid Empire. So we can see now that within a dozen years after the death of the Prophet, we can see that the Islamic rule has spread from Alexandria all the way to the borders of the Punjab. The first ruling dynasty of Islam were the Umayyads. Now, the Umayyads actually are descended from one of the arch rivals of the Prophet in Mecca. He was himself a late convert to Islam. They are, if you like, part of the old Meccan aristocracy. And once they take power, really from 661, after the death of Caliph Ali, the fourth of the rightly guided caliphs, Imam Ali of the Shia tradition, then Damascus becomes their headquarters, and that becomes the center of what we can now call the Umayyad Caliphate or the Umayyad Empire. Now, Damascus was a center of high culture and high learning. It was the administrative center of the Byzantine Empire in Syria, and therefore the administrators there were Jews and Christians, and the Umayyads basically just kept them on, and they gave them new instructions, the collection of Islamic taxes, for example, but the administration remained in the hands of those Jewish and Christian administrators, and therefore it remained in Greek. Now, the Umayyads wanted to keep the power within their own hands. There is a saying attributed to one of the first generation of Umayyad leaders: "Now that you have got power, be like boys with a ball. Pass it around amongst yourselves." Everybody agrees that with the exception of one of the Umayyad caliphs, this was really quite a corrupt regime. It was a regime that didn't follow and obey the basic principles and teachings of Islam. It was a regime that used and manipulated power to its own ends. It was a regime that also gave patronage to members of their own family. So we have a figure here of general corruption within this first Umayyad period. But from about 692, Umayyad power is consolidated in Damascus, and we can now think of the expansion of that Umayyad rule. There are three factors really that govern the stabilization and expansion of the Umayyad Empire. The first and most important is the Syrian army. Either the army conquered itself, or it was there to be sent if there were rebellions or uprisings in different places within the empire. Secondly, from the beginning of the 8th century onwards, we see the transfer from Greek to Arabic, and so we get the Arabization of this empire. And thirdly, the caliphs begin to bring in things like standard weights and measures, and they start to mint coins. So this brings the authority under their central rule. Now, let's look at the expansion of this empire, first of all going westwards. And we know that Islamic rule spreads along the Maghreb through what we would today call Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, and it reaches Morocco in about the year 710. So it's now come to the Atlantic Ocean. And the western capital of this Umayyad Empire was at Al-Qarawwayn, which is in modern-day Tunisia. What to do now with this army? Because it's largely made up of very recent converts to Islam. These are the Berber people, and they have actually embraced Islam very rapidly as Islamic rule has spread. And therefore, you have got an army. What do you do with them? Well, in the year 711, one of the Berber generals, a man called Tariq, took his army and crossed to Spain. The place that we today call Gibraltar, actually in Arabic is Jabal Tariq, the mountain, the Jabal of Tariq. and from 711, within 3 years, they had spread up through the Iberian Peninsula, all except the top northwest corner, until they had reached the Pyrenees by 714. For a period of time, about 50 years, there was a Muslim community over the Pyrenees in southwest France, with its capital at Narbonne. And during this period of time, we see Muslim raiding parties coming up through France to Toulouse, for example, and then in 732 they meet Charles Martel, the grandfather of Charlemagne, at Poitiers. And the Battle of Poitiers in 632 is always reckoned to be that decisive moment at which the Muslim raiding parties are sent back. And they are sent back eventually over the Pyrenees, and the Pyrenees become like a natural barrier at the top of Muslim Spain. The capital then is located in Cordoba until 1031, and at this time we begin to see the Christians from the northwest of Spain pushing down against the Muslim forces, and you get a period of a couple of 100 years in which the borders go to and fro, north to south, but eventually by the year 1238, the Muslim rule in Spain is just located in the Kingdom of Granada, on the very southernmost tip, and that remains the Muslim kingdom in Spain until the year 1492, which is the fall of the Kingdom of Spain, and that is the end of Muslim rule in Spain. We need now to look at the expansion of the Umayyad Empire in another direction. Let's go north. Now, north, of course, was the Byzantine Empire, and from the 650s there had been raids on the islands of the Mediterranean, Cyprus, Rhodes, Crete, for example, so that the Muslims had been pressing in that direction. Indeed, in 718, they made an attempt to take the city of Constantinople, but they were repelled from there. By 711, Muslim rule has reached Armenia, and then there is a period in which it stretches into and conquers Azerbaijan. But by 632, Azerbaijan comes under Muslim rule too. So these two countries, Armenia and Azerbaijan, form the northern border of the Islamic Empire for quite a long time. Now let's go in a northeasterly direction, because Islamic rule crossed the river Oxus, and so expanded from a forward base in Khorasan as far as Bukhara, 709, and then on to Samarkand by 712. And these two then form the northeastern border of the Islamic Empire. Now, if we go then southeast, then Muslim rule spreads out of the Arab lands, out of the Persian lands, and by the year 711 has come down into the region of Sind. That is that northern part of India, north of the River Indus. And it spreads up through northern India so that its forward capital becomes Multan from the year 773. But even before that, in 724, the Muslim armies have crossed the River Indus, and now they're going down into Gujarat and Rajasthan. But that doesn't really last very long. They're repelled from there, and so the Indus forms the boundary from the year 740 onwards. Now let's just recap then where we've got to, let's say by the year 740, which is the maximum extent of the Islamic Empire at this period. So in the west, from the Pyrenees and Spain down to Morocco, all the way along the coast of North Africa, through Egypt, down through the Arabian Peninsula, through Syria, on into Azerbaijan and Armenia in the northeast, and then across the river Oxus as far as Bukhara and Samarkand, and then southeast down through Persia, down to the River Indus in India, so into the Punjab, we can say. So this is a huge expansion in a period of only about 120 years after the death of the Prophet. And this expansion is through force of arms. It is an expansion which you could not possibly control from one centralized authority in Damascus. And therefore what happens is that we get the building of small chieftains, small empires within this larger empire, people who take over control in various parts. The role of the central Umayyad Caliphate is first of all to gather taxes, so it's a revenue generating center. Secondly, it's to disperse land which is newly conquered amongst the Muslim peoples. And thirdly, it's to have the Syrian army there ready to go in and put down any rebellions that occur. Now, the problem with local chiefs is that it opens its way for even more corruption, because you've got a situation in which you have local patronage, my brother's family must have a share out of this, and so on. And so we see within this initial Umayyad Empire various levels of corruption. We see a lack of a truly Islamic nature and way of life. We see some people drinking alcohol, being promiscuous in their relationships, not being fair and honest in their dealings, in their handling of money, and so on. We see a situation in which people abuse power to their own ends. We see a situation in which the way of Islam, in all its many dimensions, spiritual, economic, political, these are really not colouring the life of this community. And some people take exception to this. Some people say this is not the way that it should be in an Islamic empire. And so we begin to get the first rumblings then of a revolt. We get from the religious parties like the Kharijites and the Shia from the south, from Iraq and Iran. We get from the family, the clan from which the Prophet himself came, the Hashemites, who are saying, this has been a takeover by the old Meccan aristocracy. And in the end, we begin to see fomenting toward a rebellion. And this rebellion really reaches its starting point in the year 749, when one of the Hashemites from the family of Abbas, therefore we call them the Abbasids, is declared as caliph in his own right down in Kufr in Iraq. And then he marches on Damascus, he marches on the Umayyad Empire, and in 750 he defeats the Umayyad caliph of the time. Now, that marks the end of the Umayyad period in all those territories except for Spain. One of the Umayyads escapes to Spain, and he takes up what we can now call the Umayyad Caliphate of Spain. But there is a general bloodletting within the Islamic Empire at this stage. In fact, one of the Abbasid caliphs is called al-Safa, the bloodletter, because there was bloodletting, there was a slaughter of the Umayyads so that the old house would be cleared and a new ruling dynasty would take its place. This was to be the Umayyad dynasty, and we can date it from 750 to 1258, and from 762 it moves its seat of power down to Baghdad. A lot of dates and a lot of detail, This can all be found in the article that goes with this program that can be downloaded from my own website. Remember that if you've missed any of the first 3 series, they're all available on the on-demand section of the Ahlul Bayt TV website. Join me again next week when we'll be looking at the spread of Islam outside the Middle East. I look forward to seeing you then.